get started, and we're going to wrap up with this last area of accountability. So if I were a local pastor again, I think one of the ways I would think about this as a leader is one of the things I mentioned that I would want everyone in the church to know is like, what are the 3 or 4 or 5 main boundaries that we've agreed upon for everyone? Another is what we've already said is, hey, if anyone sees a concern or a policy violation, what do they do? But then a third, critical piece of information is, if there is a need to report, do we all know how to report abuse against a child or a vulnerable adult? So those are kind of three response buckets that we can use to say, are we making this clear? If you see a policy violation or a concern, you go talk to someone at the church. If it's a child or a vulnerable adult, you report and then talk to someone in the church. Does everyone know how to do that? So again, your policy team's working on this. In Indiana, all adults are mandated to report child abuse. And it's the same in Kentucky. Now, I would encourage you as a church to not just put in that legal requirement. I think the legal requirement matters. By the way, since states have started putting in mandated reporting laws for child abuse, the most egregious cases of child abuse, child deaths, have dropped by 50%. So these laws have made a real difference. But I would make the argument to any Christian, it is not just about our legal requirement. It is about an ethical requirement to speak up for children, to speak up for vulnerable people. Now, we're going to spend plenty of time on this in the safeguarding training to give examples to your people, like here are the signs or situations where you would need to report. Here's what that means. Here's what that looks like. But a few basics here. If it's an emergency, we all know to call 911. But for Indiana, there is a hotline. Now, we encourage a report to social services, child protective services, and law enforcement. The reason for that is they're 2 different agencies with 2 different broad purposes. Now, they're related. CPS has a broad purpose of assessing if a child is safe in their environment, home, school. If it's a vulnerable adult, like an adult dependent upon others for care, like a nursing home facility, the Adult Protective Services, that's their job to assess that. Is the person safe there? Of course, law enforcement, the broad purpose is to uphold the law, to investigate any criminality, law breaking. Those are related, but they're different agencies. There is supposed to be efficient communication between agencies. Of course, often they have heavy caseloads, there's other factors. It doesn't always happen. So we just recommend calling both as soon as you can, and that can make a difference. In Indiana, there's also a line for adult protective services. So when there is a vulnerable adult. So this would be like an adult with an intellectual disability, or an elder adult at a certain point where they're dependent upon others for care. And states will define that in different ways, of course. But know that there is a similar hotline for adult protective services as with child protective services. And then, Kentucky has one line for both, so it's a little bit easier. So if you believe it happened potentially in Kentucky or Indiana, you call a different number, right? Now, it's actually easy for you guys because it's not a county-wide reporting system. Some states have a county reporting system where you have to call the CPS within the county, and that means sometimes some churches we work with are on the edge of a county, so we have to put up 3 or 4 numbers. Hey, but depending on potentially where this happened, you'd have to call the county protective services, child protective services. It is that way with law enforcement. You call the local precinct where you believe it happened. And again, we're going to go into all the issues of what if you're not sure? Or what is a reasonable suspicion of abuse? Like, we're going to go through that very thoroughly in the next training with everybody. So that's coming. If you have specific questions about that, in the meantime, I'm here. But we're now going to focus on a leadership response and those issues that you are responsible for as leaders. Like, after a report's been made and then that information comes to you, what are the things to focus on? That's where I want to spend our time today. The first thing to say is what I want every leader to know is, to me, this is a situation. We know Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. I would just say that teaching applies in this situation. So what that means for me is when I was a pastor, if I had an allegation come to me about a child potentially being abused, what I believe Jesus is calling me to do is to put myself in the shoes of that child and say, if I was that child facing potential abuse, what would I want the leaders in my life to be doing to love me and care for me? And so that's what I just want to put out there. I think that is an extension, an application, really an application of Christian teaching. And we have to recognize that we, as I said, we are not trained investigators. That is not our role. And the church is not a courtroom. I would argue the church is a community of people, including many vulnerable people. And so we have a framework for response for leaders, 4-part framework. We are not to be legal counsel for people. That's not our role. We are not social workers. Also, that is not our role. We are not law enforcement or child protective services. That is not our role. As leaders, though, we do have a role and responsibility in our community. We are responsible for the safety of others. That is part of our leadership responsibility. And I would say that is our first charge when we get information related to potential abuse. And what we recommend is that you have a team. Now, that can be just leaders, your leadership team, you already have it. They assess safety. They draw lines of accountability that make sense, given what you know. They might even be temporary boundaries, temporary lines of accountability until we know more. That's sometimes part of it. And those issues can be related, right? We raise safety by saying to a person, hey, at least for now, you cannot come. We initiate care for anyone who's been hurt. And then we think, what other supports, organizations, or resources can we mobilize? And I think this is a framework that helps leaders focus on what we are called to focus on in the church, while respecting the roles of other professionals and agencies. So we're going to practice a scenario where we talk about what this might look like. Now, a couple more words about this framework. I think one of the benefits of this is that it accounts for every situation is its own situation. Every situation is unique. You can still apply this framework to any situation. And every situation might call for something different. But this will still keep you focused on the most critical areas. Also, I think this framework is helpful because the day you learn about something, the situation develops in a week, and a month, and 3 months. So the first you hear about it might be someone in our church got arrested. That might be the first thing you hear. The first thing might be no one's been arrested, but this has been reported. And they get arrested in 3 months, or not. It still allows you to bring this framework to every situation with what you know and ask, what is God calling us to attend and account for safety, for any appropriate boundaries or accountability, appropriate care, and getting other resources or things mobilized that can help us. Before we go into an example and practice this, any thoughts or questions?
Where would, as a church that practices membership,
Yeah.
we've been, for a couple of years, trying to talk through communication, whether
Yeah.
it's, when people get arrested and they're a member of the
Yeah.
church, or, like at what point, or is that like around number 4?
So I would put that under 4
Yeah.
because you can reach out to us and say, help us think through communication. Can we just talk for an hour? We're glad to set that up quickly. And it will depend on the situation. An arrest is a public thing with public records. So that's a public deal. So I think that does impact public communication. And so there's all sorts of factors.
Yeah.
And communication, like I said, can impact safety and other things
Exactly.
dramatically, sometimes. Sometimes less so. So there are all sorts of factors. So because each situation is unique, that's one, and I know some really good organizations. One in particular I'm thinking about. They work with faith-based organizations. They've told us communication is so hard because there can be so many different factors. They said, we're reluctant to weigh in on that with organizations because it can be so complicated. We do weigh in on it. If you reach out to us, we'll help you think it through. We'll try to help you.
Yeah.
It's still not easy sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now let me just say this too. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. Can you go 3 more, Bobby? Go to 1. Yeah, there we go. Now, when it is a non-vulnerable adult, and I'm using that, I explained a vulnerable adult is usually an adult with an intellectual disability or an adult of a certain age where they're really dependent upon others for care. When we're talking about a non-vulnerable adult, all of us in this room probably, in that technical sense, when that person has faced abuse, we typically have a policy that says, again, because that's not something we report on behalf of an adult, that we can report internally. Now, as leaders, we want to take a clear posture of telling any adult, if you wanted to report any potential criminal abuse, assault, things like that, it is your call, but we're here to support you in that if that's what you want. If it is intimate partner violence or an assault, that raises present issues of safety very often. And so a thing we'll talk about in the safeguarding training is one thing to say in a conversation if someone brings up that kind of abuse is to ask them, how safe do you feel right now at home or work or wherever is appropriate? And we'll give some skills on that. We have a practical guide for walking alongside someone who is suffering intimate partner violence. But with assault or intimate partner violence with a non-vulnerable adult, we still want to defer to whether they speak up. We often wouldn't report immediately, especially without them knowing, because that can put them in greater danger and often does invite retaliation. Now, it's still a concerning issue, but what we would want to work toward is trying to get a safety plan in place for them, get them connected to resources that can help them empower their agency to make certain decisions. That's tough. In some cases, churches will still feel conscience bound to report it to the police, even if the victim, the non-vulnerable adult victim, is not ready themselves to report it. I'll give you an example. If I was on staff again as a pastor, and I had an intern who allegedly assaulted another intern on a date or something. That's a crime, and even if that person who was assaulted, allegedly, was not ready to go to the authorities because it's someone on my staff and it happened within my church staff, I would likely feel conscience bound to take that information to the authorities. Now, I would try to take a posture of support toward that person and let them know, hey, even though I'm giving this information to them, you still have a choice of whether you talk to law enforcement or not. That's still your choice. I want to talk to them about a safety plan. I want to draw certain boundaries with that other intern, for example. There's all sorts of complications there. But as a team, I'm still coming back to the framework of always keeping safety at the forefront, thinking about any appropriate accountability or boundaries, thinking about what care is appropriate, and getting other appropriate help or resources in place. And that's going to serve us well. Let's look at scenario 5. So here's the situation. You are a leader in a local church. Susan, age 23, female, a staff person who works with college students, discloses that Tim, age 41, male, the young adults pastor and her supervisor, touched her sexually and she froze. She says she's beginning to understand how Tim groomed her over time. At the same time, she feels tremendous amounts of shame and guilt, like it is all her fault. Susan, with the help of another staff person, comes to you to disclose this. They show you text where Tim has communicated sexually with her. What are some things, let's just start with the first basic question. What are some things to say in this initial conversation? What are some things to not say? What do you think? Initial thoughts? That's right. You say, I am so sorry. This is not your fault. Absolutely. Absolutely. Commend her courage, bravery for speaking up. And she found a way to do it, right? She found someone, got enough encouragement to come and then talk to someone else. Good. Yeah. How about, we don't say this. Why didn't you go to Tim? No. If someone, and by the way, what would you call this? Is there a power dynamic here? A clear one. He's her boss, essentially, supervisor. He is much older, a huge age difference. He has a lot of, we did talk a lot about male power, in a lot of church environments, men hold more power. Okay. And so when someone in a power dynamic touches someone sexually, that is an abuse of power. And she had a clear response that is a trauma response. Freezing is a trauma response. That is normal, that is typical. So we also wouldn't say, did you scream, did you run, did you fight? Why not? We would never say that because it's not fight or flight, that's reductionistic. It's fight or flight or freeze or fawn, which means you're just compliant because you're scared. And if you feel like if you're not compliant, something worse might happen, like the person might get even more violent or something like that. But there's other trauma responses that are typical too. So it's a whole range of common responses, but freezing is a clear common one. We should all know that as leaders. And as described, what she's describing is a sexual assault. That's what it is. That is a crime in all 50 states. Now, because it just makes it easier for this conversation, she also has other corroborating information, like here are the texts that are sexual communications that she brings forward when she discloses this. Okay, other things for that initial conversation that occur to you, things you might say. Do you feel safe? How about what do you need? And I think immediate issues of like, you don't have to come to the office right now until you feel ready. And by the way, and this gets down into, okay, safety. how might we consider, so we're asking her, what do you need to feel safe? So say she has a sister in town. Do you want to stay with your sister? So if she's thinking, Tim might come by my house. Is there just asking her about safety to talk through any issue like that we might be able to help with? As far as jumping down to the third one, care. If Tim has done this, if I'm like a lead pastor and she's telling that to me, I might say, like, who do you want to come? Do you want someone to come and meet with you or pray with you or just sit with you to process this? And recognize it might not be a male pastor like Tim who needs to be doing that right now. That might impact her sense of safety. That might not be how we can best care for her. And so trauma-informed principles that I mentioned earlier, empowerment, voice, and choice is one of them. So as we're thinking about safety and care, we just want to think about that principle of what choices do we want to make sure she knows she has and empower those. And again, to me, that just gets back to loving your neighbor as yourself and what Jesus told us to do. Now, do you see how safety and boundaries and accountability are often linked together, which means, what do you think, given this type of disclosure, we might consider with regard to Tim, at least as a temporary measure? What do you think?
So we put on some kind of leave.
Okay, we would consider putting him on some kind of leave. And so if Susan did need to come to the office or drop by and just pick something up, she needs to know that Tim is not going to be there. If she did want to come to worship on Sunday and felt able to do that, she would need to know Tim is not going to be there, right? If someone has assaulted you, you don't need to come around a corner and meet them or see them across the room in the worship service. That just, in our view, can't happen. Now, that doesn't mean we don't meet with Tim. It doesn't mean we don't care about Tim. It doesn't mean we've already pronounced him guilty, by the way. It just doesn't mean that. But we do have to put up some of those boundaries. So we consider that. And yeah, a lot of these, again, are related. We would also likely want to tell Susan, we have a sexual assault center here. They have a lot of resources or counselors that might be really experienced who you might want to talk to. So you're not telling her she has to do this or making her or anything like that, but you're offering her support. You're offering her, hey, know this is available for whenever you feel like this is something you want to do or can reach out, or we can go with you. And for us as leaders, here's a real practical thing to know. Domestic violence shelters, sexual assault centers, child advocacy centers, often they have specific services they offer, and not all of them offer all the same services. They have limitations. And some of them have limitations of who they serve. Sometimes it's county. So you're in Floyd County, correct? Right here, we're in Floyd County. So some of the places like that for Floyd County don't help someone in the neighboring county. They just have to limit who they can help. Now, some places will help anybody or try to or refer them. But one of the worst things we can do is say to like a woman in a violent marriage, go here, they'll help you. And they're like, no, we won't help you because you live in this county, not Floyd County. We should know that ahead of time. So it's a longer, it's something to maybe think about doing in the next 6 months. Where are the nearest child advocacy center, domestic violence shelter, sexual assault centers? Can we have a couple of us go visit them? And can you just show us what services you offer? Can we introduce ourselves? We're a church in the area. What services do you provide, and whom do you serve? That's a really good thing to do. So when you refer someone to a place like that they should be able to help them, and with what. And offer to go with them. If they want to go report to law enforcement, absolutely. Would you like one of us to go with you? Would someone from our leadership team? Would you like it to be a woman? That kind of thing. You just ask, you take that posture. Questions, other thoughts? Other thoughts about this scenario?
I'm just thinking also like long term, if she's not ready to like step into counseling or therapy or
Yeah,
like just thinking long term that we're staying connected and supporting her so that she knows at
That's right.
any point we're here if you are ready
That's right.
to step into whatever resources that we're encouraging her to.
Absolutely. And when a violation's connected to a workplace, it can be hard to go back to that workplace. And it's nothing you all do wrong, or it's not that you're unsupportive. For many, they just don't feel like they can go back and work there anymore. So you just do the very best you can, make options, offer supports as best you can. Again, one of the reasons we exist, it's not to take ownership of these issues away from you in any way. These are issues you all have to take ownership of. But we want you to feel free to reach out to us and say, hey, here's what we're doing. Can we just set up an hour to talk through what we're doing? And maybe you see something we're not seeing, or we're not sure about this aspect of it. So we can just talk it out. And if we can help you in any way, again, not tell you what to do, but support you. And that would come under number 4, right? Reaching out to outside organizations, other resources. We're glad to do that if we can help you. We do that all the time. We do that every single week, just about, at least, if not multiple churches. We're having direct consultation like that to help them think through how they're responding. Is there anything they're missing? Or we think we should be doing this, but we're not sure because of the specifics of the situation. So can we talk about it? Yeah. Clergy sexual abuse is not always a crime. Now, any crossing of a sexual boundary with a child is always a crime. We know this. Assault is always a crime. About 15 states have criminalized, even when it's not a physically coercive crossing of a boundary, but because of the power differential inherent of being clergy, about 15 states have criminalized that with adults even. Now with a child, again, it would always be a crime. An assault, physical assault would always be a crime. And as far as I know, Indiana is not one of those states. My state, Virginia, is not one of those states either. But the key is that we as leaders know this is a huge abuse of power, and we need to treat it as such, even if that is not going to be something likely that comes through the criminal court system, if that makes sense. So I talked about specific resources and knowing, and I would say, putting your nearest child advocacy center in the policy, in the resources section, the nearest domestic violence shelter. And as I said, it's a longer term project, but going to visit to make sure you have clarity on what they offer and whom they serve is critical. And then the reality of grooming is that, so someone like Tim in this situation, who Tim is made up, right? It's a made up name. But in this situation, people like Tim who do something like this groom not just Susan, but others on staff and the whole congregation, to think of him as someone who would never do that kind of thing, which means we are in the worst position to assess the factual nature of what has happened or not happened. But churches often put themselves in that role of investigator, and I would argue churches have to take on the role of deciding what is appropriate and bringing any appropriate accountability. There's no way to put that off on anyone else. True accountability has to come within the organization itself. However, it's critical that we, knowing how grooming often works, that we have an outlet for independent, at the minimum, consultation, or in certain cases, investigation when that's needed. Now, independent investigation, for most churches, most often, we want that to come through law enforcement, child protective services, adult protective services. It doesn't mean, hiring Grace or someone to do it all on your own, or hiring an independent organization to do it all on your own. But certainly there are cases where that's needed. But there are many cases where the facts are not in doubt. And so you don't need, in every case, an investigation. In many cases, the victim has told you what happened. In many cases, the offender owns up to it. Not always, of course. So not every case calls for that, but churches under that fourth area of looking to other organizations or resources, that's part of it. So that's, again, something your policy team is going to be thinking about, whether to include something about that. You have to give yourself room to maneuver and respond to each situation with what's appropriate. So again, it's something we advise you add as something to consider. And the key is we don't take on the role of primary investigator. That's just not appropriate. Just like we would never take on, we're going to be the primary legal go-to or social work go-to or whatever. All right. Proactive leaders who are safe, trustworthy, transparent, you guys make all the difference. So I just want to close. Bobby, if you can just put up the graphic of the framework. All these areas, again, I don't think it's controversial, but these things, again, don't just happen without us tending to them and cultivating them. And you're already doing really, really good things in these areas. It's about continuing to take it forward and help your people understand how this is a part of and a priority within our own Christian faith. Raising the education level, that really matters with kids, with adults, not just our staff, not just our volunteers, but everyone. Clarifying appropriate conduct, that helps us in so many ways. It will deter some bad actors. People who aren't bad actors, but they're just immature, it will deter them too, and that's good too. But it will help us also set the table to interrupt someone who is boundary testing, which is what a lot of grooming behavior actually is, by the way. Looking for an opportunity, a vulnerability to take something further. And clarity on the boundaries sets the table for accountability, and that really matters in prevention. And then having a policy where we respond and attend to the most important things in prevention and in response, that really matters. So I know this is a ton to take in. So I just want to say two things in closing. One, please feel free to step away from this topic and material for a few days or a few weeks. But the reason we give you these slides and other resources, so Lindsay and Bobby, I'm going to be putting these, you already have the slides, but we can put them in a PDF form that it's easy for people to download. I would just encourage you, because this is a little bit like drinking from the fire hose, right? Just take a little bit of time away, but then come back to it at some point and do some reflective work. And you'll remember, we've even built into the slides some places for you to go back and do some specific guided reflective work, if that's helpful. I had a wonderful seminary professor. She was an expert in how humans learn. And she said, she would always tell us, look, an ounce of reflection leads to a pound of learning. So please set aside some time, again, after a break, to do some reflective work. And again, I hope this is helpful to you as leaders, to carry forward as a framework, to really continue to further and cultivate these areas. That's the first thing. Do that reflective work. And do it individually, but do it as a team as well. And then the last thing is just, again, care for yourselves. This is heavy. So as your schedule allows today, tomorrow's a work day, right, for church staffs, many of us. But the next week, as you're able, build in some time to attend to, caring for yourself in ways that recognize the heaviness of today. You got 4 long hours of this training. And there's no way for this not to impact you spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically. So make that a priority. That's not selfish, by the way. That's respecting how God has designed us to think through, what emotions am I feeling? What do I need to process through? What do I need spiritually? Do I need to take a walk and talk with God? Do I need to have it out about something? Do I need to do some spiritual practices that would help me? What do I need physically? Do I need sleep? Do I need nutrition? Do I need exercise? Do I need to connect with my support system? All of those things really matter. So just please make that a priority as your schedule allows the next few hours and days. And, something light, something rejuvenating as you're able to, that really matters. All right, can I just close us in a word of prayer? All right. God, thanks for this time with my brothers and sisters.